Αγαπητοί φίλοι, φίλες και μέλη του Αιγαία, καλώς ήρθατε. Η σημερινή διάλεξη αποτελεί για μας μεγάλη χαρά για δύο βασικούς λόγους. Πρώτον, εγκαινιάζει τη νέα σειρά των Αιγαιακών διαλέξεων για το έτος 2014. Μετά την εξαιρετικά μεγάλη επιτυχία των περσινών διαλέξεων, αποφασίσαμε μαζί με το Σουηδικό Ινστιτούτο να συνεχίσουμε τις διαλέξεις και για αυτό το έτος. 8 διαλέξεις έχουν προγραμματιστεί για φέτος, όπως θα δείτε στο πρόγραμμα, που έχουμε ήδη μοιράσει. Προσπαθήσαμε να συμπεριλάβουμε διαλέξεις από όλες τις περιοχές και περιόδους, από τα παλαιολιθικά χρόνια μέχρι και τους μικηναϊκούς χρόνους ή και γεωμετρικούς χρόνους, από τη Μακεδονία μέχρι την Κύπρο. Ελπίζουμε και θα είναι ιδιαίτερη τιμή για μας να παρευρεθείτε, αν όχι σε όλες, τουλάχιστον στις περισσότερες από αυτές. Ο δεύτερος λόγος είναι ότι η σημερινή ομιλήτρια, Δ. Αναστασία Χριστοφιλοπούλου, αποτελεί βασικό μέλος της ομάδας του Αιγαία. Η σημερινή διάλεξη έχει τίτλο «Moving up the Property Ladder, Transformations and Innovations in Aegean Households and Communities». Τιμώντας τη συνεργασία μας με το Σουηδικό Ινστιτούτο, παρακαλέσαμε την ομιλήτρια να μιλήσει στα αγγλικά, σε μια γλώσσα κατανοητή τόσο από τους Έλληνες όσο και από τα μέλη του Σουηδικού Ινστιτούτου. Συμφοιτητές από τα Γιάννενα, είμαι πολύ χαρούμενος και ιδιαίτερα συγκινημένος που την παρουσιάζω σήμερα. Η Αναστασία τελείωσε τις προπτυχιακές σπουδές στο Πανεπιστήμιο Ανίνων, κατόπιν συνέχισε τις μεταπτυχιακές της σπουδές στο Πανεπιστήμιο Κρήτης και ύστερα τελείωσε την διδακτορική της διατριβή στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Cambridge με θέμα την οικιακή αρχιτεκτονική κατά την πρώιμη εποχή του Σιδήρου. Είναι βασικό μέλος της ομάδας του Αιγαία και είναι υπεύθυνη για τις βιβλιοκρισίες μαζί με την Τατιάνα Θεοδωροπούλου και τον Colin MacDonald. Τα τελευταία χρόνια ζει μόνιμα στην Αγγλία και εργάζεται ως curator στο πολύ γνωστό μουσείο Fitzwilliam. Κλείνοντας, θα ήθελα να επισημάνω το εξής. Τον τελευταίο καιρό ακούμε πολύ συχνά από τους πολιτικούς μας για τους νέους επιστήμονες που φεύγουν στο εξωτερικό προς αναζήτηση μιας καλύτερης επαγγελματικής σταδιοδρομίας. Είναι ειλικρά κρίμα που μέχρι σήμερα ουδής εξ αυτών έχει ενδιαφερθεί να δώσει ένα τέλος σε αυτή την πληγή που κοντεύει να γίνει η μάστιγα. Η Αναστασία είναι το χαρακτηριστικό παράδειγμα ενός λαμπρού επιστήμονα με πανεπιστημιακά διπλώματα, συγγραφικό έργο, νέες ιδέες, όρεξη για δουλειά, που κατόρθωσε να βρει δουλειά στο εξωτερικό, αντάξια των προσόντων της. Εμείς της ευχόμαστε κάθε καλό και επιτυχία στο έργο της.
Introduction, and also can I just say thank you for the wonderful hospitality of the Swedish Institute tonight. To give you a brief introduction, in this paper I want to explore the transformations occurring in the early Iron Age households, along with their significance for the relevant communities and societies. By using the paradigms of 12th to the 6th century communities in 3 different geographical and cultural regions. So we should be looking tonight at the Cyclades, some examples of the Cyclades, Crete and the Eastern Aegean. But first I want to take some time to explain why the limitation to the island environment is central to the conception of this study. The island environment not only serves here as a geographical set of evidence other than the mainland, or even as 3 distinct island environments, the Cyclades, Crete and the Eastern Aegean, displaying different geomorphologic, environmental or cultural realities, but also serves as a theoretical entity, exploring the relationship between insularity and architectural conception. So I will not attempt, given the limitations of this presentation, to fully explore all differences or similarities of architectural types, use of space, or domestic morphology of the 3 island regions. But I will, however, try to delineate when features are shared across islands and how is insularity affecting their perceptions of domestic space. Before turning to the examination of region-specific factors of household morphology, I would like to briefly review some of the recent theoretical debates in household archaeology, as well as their influence on the study of the Greek Iron Age. One can go on to a great extent about the importance of household studies in classics and Greek archaeology, but it is mostly in the sense of interdisciplinarity that this research direction has more to offer. Indeed, if there is one field of classical archaeology that has truly incorporated research methodologies from other social sciences, that is household archaeology. This innovation, however, did not come to the field of classical archaeology, but has arrived there, did not spring out of the field of classical archaeology, but has arrived there following the example of world archaeology. Two of the disciplines that have most certainly cross-fertilized household studies are ethnography and ethnoarchaeological studies. As a result of that, a number of researchers have gone as far as to identify a household as an ethnographic phenomenon and not as an archaeological one. Others recognize households as centers of production, distribution, transmission, and reproduction, and declare that the embedding of household archaeology in a comparative ethnographic matrix is vital to any approach which will allow archaeologists to draw inferences about past household behavior. Semiotics is another prominent example of cross-fertilization in archaeology. Semiotics has much been involved in the hermeneutics of material culture and has also greatly influenced research in household archaeology. A principle of the semiotic approach to architectural analysis is that architecture, like language or any other cultural product, is comprised of a system of signs for the communication of information. The meaning of this information is transferred by means of a cultural specific set of conventions or codes. Therefore, buildings can be correctly read or understood only if the coded meanings can be accurately interpreted by users. And a good example of that adaptation of this theory to the architecture of the early Minoan community is the example of the study of Myrtos in East Crete, which was provided by Sanders. Finally, there are growing voices that household archaeology should embrace even more cross-cultural studies than what it has already done in order to encompass problems related to sociological questions in its archaeological material. Therefore, increased cross-fertilization between the social sciences of archaeology, social anthropology, and even environmental psychology is something that this discipline has to work more, as the study of social space not only seems suited for interdisciplinary work, but its success actually depends on these collaborations. Turning now to Greek household archaeology, however, before the adaptation of the above ideas, material culture in Greek housing was only used to illustrate the world that we already knew from the literary sources. In the last 2 decades, however, influence of new archaeology, and more importantly of social archaeology, has finally filtered through household and classical studies. Therefore, an increased interest in recognizing domestic assemblages as contexts of behavior, as well as ways for illuminating early Greek social history, had quite an impact on the study of households in this period. At about the same time, a number of pioneering research cases have successfully enlightened aspects of the Greek Dark Age and geometric societies on the basis of burial evidence. These new methodological disciplines, along with a considerable increase of available data, gave way to similar case studies in the Dark Ages and the Iron Age domestic context. Most importantly, this development has brought with it the consciousness that textual misconceptions not only hampered the archaeology of classical period, but also that of the early Iron Age. We know that the relationship between textual and archaeological material can be as complex and as difficult to grasp as the relationship between ethnohistory and archaeology. The previous domination of textual evidence over interpretations of archaeological material in Greek archaeology has also advanced the need for a reappraisal of the same texts with a critical reinvestigation of their relationship to the archaeological remains that can substantially alter our interpretations of domestic behavior. And finally, we have become aware that the absence of textual sources for the Greek Iron Age does not prevent the interpretation of household behavior and functions in this early period from the architecture and material culture itself, with the aid of ethnographic and cross-cultural research. Older publications without good contextual information are very often one of the main concerns for anyone in the field of of classical household archaeology. But rather than dismissing this material, a number of researchers such as Alt, Nevet, and Goldberg have recently demonstrated approaches to such excavation reports which can extract information on household behavior. They have also highlighted the need to take a critical perspective on the extent to which archaeological assemblages provide important information about household activities and the extent to which analogy is useful for interpreting this data. And finally, Penelope Allison has furthermore highlighted the lack of evidence for many all-encompassing models of household behavior and shows how an attempt to comprehend the agencies which form a household can lead to a better comprehension of the roles of households in the wider community. At the same time, she insists that in the case of Greek household analysis, as for domestic material in other contexts, largely processual approaches are necessary in order to produce well-grounded data sets to which more sociological questions and assumptions concerning gender, consumption and production, privacy and symbolism can then be addressed and applied. Now, let us now take a break from theory and have a very quick look and introduce the three sets of material I will be using to illustrate these examples tonight. I just want to say that I'm not going to provide a very detailed account of all these sites and explain their history of development because I'm aware that most of you are very familiar with this, but I will just try to highlight examples where they are important in terms of my argument. So we will be working on the Cyclades, the Eastern Aegean, and Crete. Now, for our first set of examples, the Cyclades. One of the sites, what you're looking now is Zagora. This is just a map to show you the regions. So for the Cyclades, I will be using examples from islands such as Sifnos, where one important case, for example, is the late Bronze Age habitation of Aios Andreas. Most of you know that this is a fortified acropolis protected by two walls whose initial phase of habitation dates to the 13th century until the first half of the 12th century. And after this, the site was abandoned and remained so until the late geometric times, approximately the second half of the 8th century. And one of the striking elements that we will be looking at tonight in terms of housing is the interaction between the architecture of the late Bronze Age remains and the later geometric buildings. Second site, this is again some of the houses we will be looking at tonight from Sifnos. Second site, of course, that doesn't really need much introduction is the amazing excavation of Zagora, to which the Australian Institute, as we know, has recently returned there and is studying again. And I just want to focus on three prominent examples of this site. One is the famous household around courtyard H21, which comprises rooms H22, 23 on the left side. Here, this is the courtyard. This is the main focus of the household, the room with the P-shaped bench, and number H28. And two other very interesting examples of households. One is the one comprising first and initially a single room, H26, 27, which will be later subdivided in two rooms to be used as a storage space. This is the courtyard, and then living kind of accommodation would be provided by this room, H42. And then the similar situation is observed in the household above that, where you have again a single space originally, which is subdivided into smaller storage areas later, and then again two further accommodation areas are being built on the left. That's numbers 41 and 42, and we will explain exactly what's happening in these examples as we go. So I just want to give you a quick look of those. Now, another interesting example is Prophytis Ilias, the Acropolis of Prophytis Ilias in Emporio, excavated by the BSA several decades ago. And there, of course, we are looking at two very distinctive categories of, I'm not going to say houses because not all of them are houses. So we have the megaron-shaped structures, and then we have the so-called bench houses. Here, the previous one was megaron, one of the non-domestic architectures, the one you saw. And this is a nice example of the combination of a megaron shape, the lower megaron and a bench house. So we will be looking at the spatial distribution and the use of space in these two distinctive categories. And this is two further houses from Emporio. Not yet. Then we will turn to Crete, yes, and we will, of course, look at two very interesting examples from Halasmenos and Katalymata, and we will be looking at the interaction between these two sites. I'm not going to introduce these sites even more because you're all very familiar with this, plus the excavators of the sites are here with us tonight. But we will be looking at the three late Minoan 3C megara and the late geometric Ikos, which comes later and is built above megaron A. And then we shall look at some of the household units that are observed in Katalymata, in the Hag Gorge. And finally, we will be looking at Carfi, some of the East Quarter megarons, in relation with we'll be looking at the differences between these architectures and the more agglutinative types of houses that are found in the West Quarter of Carfi. So I want to start examining those by looking at the spatial evolution and functionality of these spaces within early Iron Age households. Before I start, I want to talk about how the study of social space within early Iron Age households can be defined. How it can be defined with reference to the numbers and disposition of rooms, the subdivision of the house, and the position of doorways that indicate the nature of internal communication. Now, in a number of examples that we will be looking at tonight, we can observe that in one-room houses, multifunctional utilization is something dominant, whereas later in multi-room houses, the possibility of a monofunctional use for each room within the houses increases. In the early Iron Age, one- and two-room houses in generally predominate, and we have many examples of that. In these cases, the arrangement of rooms is sequential. Because one room is situated behind another, the rear room was only accessible via the front door of the house, of the front room. Typical examples of that can be found across the Aegean and Crete in a number of occasions, such as Crete examples from Carfi and Vrokastro exemplify these. In the Cyclades, we have examples from Aios Andreas and Sifnos. In Sifnos, as well as earlier examples, some of the earlier examples of the houses in Zagora. This is the examples from Sifnos and Zagora. Now, houses with a more complex pattern of space organization emerged, as we know, in the late 8th century, and the later examples in Zagora testify this transition. And these houses allow more than 2 rooms now, but a linear arrangement is still very dominant, and it's not replaced by a radial room arrangement until the Archaic period. In the Archaic period, the rooms were placed alongside one another in a paratactic manner. And furthermore, the houses now include a courtyard, as in the examples of Zagora and also in Miletus, or they can include a corridor, as in the examples of the Azoria houses or the Driros houses. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide with a Driros example. Multi-period sites also allow us to study changes in the architecture and activity areas of households as a result of functional, social, and other shifts over time. And these changes, distinguishable through the different phases of the house, are the result of the developmental cycle of the house, which was in turn influenced by both the family cycle, its socio-biological development, and also the economic cycle, the development and extent of household activities. Sites such as Zagora exemplify these changes. The older houses in the site were surrounded by open spaces. The houses were furnished with benches, mostly used as storage and work area, but occasionally used for sitting and sleeping. All daily tasks were conducted in the one room of the household, which was multifunctional. There was no further divisions between a living room and a storage room. If there was a need to subdivide areas, this would be determined by social convention. For instance, an area for men separated from that for women, for older people that from younger people, and so on. Privacy is a notion which definitely was very restricted in this kind of domestic environment, and we should assume that when the weather permitted it, a number of activities could have been placed outside the house, and similarly family life could have been played out in the public sphere, since many family activities could have taken place either inside or outside the house. In that respect, the entire settlement can be viewed as a setting for daily life activities. The changes that we observe in Zagora after the second half of the 8th century affected the overall character of the settlement. Houses were supplied with courtyards, as well with a small, a middle-sized, and a large room, previously the main room of the household. In addition to these structural changes, a long wall divided the settlement into a western zone with houses in which rooms were arranged in linear gradation, and an eastern zone, where the rooms were in more radial arrangement. This alteration might equally indicate changes in the internal structure of the community and the family. The reproduction of the same house types across the settlement seems to show that it was carried out with the consent of all the inhabitants of Zagora. If common consent existed, then the degree of social stratification was not high, unless hierarchical relationships were expressed in a symbolic way, difficult to uncover by archaeological remains. It is very difficult to find other sites where a similar transformation, of course, can be proven across the whole settlement. And we shall, however, for the early period, note that the exception. We shall, of course, note the exception of Miletus in Asia Minor, where a comparable development from few room houses to multiple room houses can be observed. Similarly, in the subsequent Archaic period in Crete, we shall also note the exception of Azoria. The site undergoes a similar process of urbanization during the Archaic period, witnessed by the internal modifications to the plans of the houses that now demonstrate a tendency to divide and compartmentalize living and storage space, as well as by the construction of the spine wall, which was designed to regularize the uneven terrain. Now, before turning to the discussion related to the internal communication within the house, it is worth commenting on the differences between unplanned early Iron Age settlements and later early Archaic and Classical settlements with respect to the social implications that these different arrangements, both in household and community scale, have. In the early Iron Age, settlements such as Agora, Onandros, or Agios Andreas in Sifnos display an arrangement of rectilinear units and households that not only vary considerably in terms of size and construction techniques, but also in the arrangement of internal space. Moreover, the nature of many of these households makes it difficult to define them as coherent residential units and hence to comment in detail on their average size or internal organization. We have already noted that households with unplanned settlements of the 8th and 7th century BC provide some examples of architectural features familiar from the 5th and 4th century BC structures, such as open courts and porch structures. However, there are important differences between these early structures and their successors within later planned settlements of the early archaic or the classical period. Interior living space in these early houses was much more restricted, and the small number of rooms they display would have offered little opportunity for the separation of activities or individuals. Even in the larger houses, space was subdivided to a much lesser extent, and although these might have been particular areas of the large rooms which were customarily used for specific activities, those activities and the individuals that were performing them would not have been separated physically. Let us not forget that the courtyard appearing in a number of these early examples, although an enclosed space, does not seem to have provided the kind of private environment that became so fundamental in the later classical houses. Equally, the spatial flexibility we have previously noted in terms of the number of activities that could have been carried inside and outside the house in the early Iron Age, as a result of the non-existing strict physical separation of spaces, is eventually lost once the settlement assumes a planned arrangement. As one would expect, a planned settlement arrangement means a number of predefined ideas, although not always very strict ones in the early stages, about the number and size of households within the settlement, their architectural arrangement in house plots, and consequently about the number, size, and particular functions of spaces within a single household. We can observe these contrasts between early Iron Age households and later archaic and classical examples by comparing the case of Zagora with settlements such as Vroulia. In the example of Vroulia, founded in the early 7th century with a settlement plan standardized from the time of its conception, the houses form a row with 1 or 2 rooms behind the court. However, the repetition of a house plan with contiguous rooms behind the courtyard brings us closer to the idea of spatial separation of activities and individuals. To this is added the fact that no subsequent modification occurs to this settlement, in contrast with how heavily modified the examples of sites such as Agora were, for example, so that the visible plan of Vroulia mirrors the original conception of its founders, which was planned rows of houses. Definitely, the idea of the entire settlement acting as a theatre for daily life activities, with activities easily changing places, was not the case for Vroulia. Internal communication is another point of interest with respect to the social arrangement of the household. Internal communication is determined by the number and arrangement of the rooms, the structure of accessways and room functions. These features were also part of the innovations witnessed in the course of the transformation from the early Iron Age to the Archaic period. The position of doorways within a household is indicative of the structure of internal communications. The row houses, systems that appear before the appearance of the courtyard, and the radial arrangement of houses indicate the transitional situation, and they will persist throughout the whole period. The reorganization of the house at that period required the invention of a new type of room, functioning as a transitional space, from which people could have access to all other parts of the building. This, according to Lang, was a precondition for restricted or communal access and supported the separation of rooms, facilitating the distinction of function and the status within the household. This transitional space was usually a hall or a courtyard and indicates a more sophisticated and thoroughly planned phase than the row house arrangement. 3 different types of rooms now existed: the room with 1 door, a walk-through room with 2 doors, and a transitional space with at least 3 doors. These types dominated in domestic architecture for the subsequent periods, whereas the sequential arrangement of rooms, which was quite usual in the early Iron Age, was maintained in later periods only in the sacred architecture of temples. I want to turn now to examine a little bit the symbolic and behavioral sphere of the early Iron Age households. As we know, and is more or less widely accepted among researchers of the domestic environment, the household as a social entity is an agglomeration of individual intentions, desires, and behaviors, which contend and compromise with those of other individuals in order to produce household decisions and actions. The examination of household examples in the early Iron Age has also made apparent that a household in a particular geographical and temporal frame is not a tidy, fixed, or closed category. Moreover, the specification of who of what is contained in a household and the boundaries between households are often hard to pin down. This is partly because household structure is not something static. In the course of even one lifetime, the roles, status, economic resources, and personnel can even change. Equally, gender roles might change as well. In relation to these two observations, I will discuss now a number of criteria affecting spatial behavior in domestic architecture, such as the dimension of the living space, the topographical placement of household units within the community, and the symbolic implication of space occupied by previous generations within a settlement. Obviously, dimension and form of living space influence spatial behavior, and as expected, the least complex spatial behavior is usually found within smaller houses with only little space available per inhabitant. In houses with little space per inhabitant, the same personal area is normally used for eating, working, and sleeping, while in houses with more space show more complex activity patterns. In the case of Katalimata, in the houses in the Hagors, of the case studies that we are looking at here, the one-room households in Katalimata exemplify this kind of least complex spatial behavior, with very limited space available per inhabitant. And in these examples, the household reflects a concentration of observable relations between the different generations, age groups, and classes of the community, or the division of labor between these. The next criterion relates to socio-psychological factors operating within a settlement and the different spatial behavioral implications of a household placed either centrally within the community or on its margins. Centrally placed households within a settlement have generally optimal possibilities through accidental meetings to develop contacts with the rest of the households and structures, and possibly to exercise control over other units. Centrally, the prominent example of the household around Courtyard H21 in Zagora, which is centrally placed within the rest of the households, has also socially more central. It was also socially more central among the other domestic units. The impact of this effect should be expected to increase where the size and the number of households in the settlement increases. However, this theory, implying that dominant households and important communal facilities are normally located in the center, does not seem to apply in all of the cases of larger settlements that appear as agglomerations of houses, as in most of the Greek early Iron Age examples. In settlements such as Karfi, for example, where a large concentration of agglutinative buildings occurs in the center of the settlement, provides an example of a number of high investment buildings, both in terms of quality of construction and of significant architectural features, such as the cluster of the Megara placed marginally. These cases suggest a different theory, and this is exactly where elements such as difficult topography and elevation come to play a significant role. In settlements where houses are not placed on a plain, isotropic, or visually open surface, topography and elevation are two factors far more important than centrality in signifying dominant positions. The question emerging then is to what extent it is safe to employ in archaeology these general or universal models created by social space theory to explain our data. These universal factors have been, of course, recognized as such in the examination of culture-specific contexts, and their applicability is questioned whenever a new cultural context is being examined by their means, which means that we can recognize at the same moment the danger of of trying to test a specific culture upon the characteristics of a different one. A final principle of spatial behavior analysis concerns the symbolic dimension. In sites where continuous occupation over a considerable time can be attested, later generations will be confronted with a previously developed and meaningfully constituted social landscape. Therefore, there is the possibility for ideological use of the landscape with place values and tradition values acting as a source both of social cohesion and social control. Halasmenos during the late geometric reoccupation, during the late geometric reoccupation of the site must definitely have been confronted with a meaningfully constructed previous social landscape that influenced the construction and character of the later phase. For example, the late geometric Ikos, which is symbolically placed on top of the late Minoan 3C ruins of the 3 Megara. Now, I want to turn now to examining gender questions in these early Iron Age island households and societies. The task of engendering ancient Greek societies was first introduced, as we know, by scholars who mostly work in ancient literature than classical archaeology. Susan Walker, for example, aimed to assimilate the archaeological and literary evidence by searching for aspects of domestic architecture which corresponds to the literally based model of women. And later, Michael Jameson was probably the first one to set a critical eye to the kind of evidence that both archaeological and literary material can provide on ancient Greek households, as well as to acknowledge that each class of this material presents different potential and also has different constraints. Lisa Nevet was next to examine gender relations for classical houses in Greece, and in particular the results of applying terms originating from the literary evidence to the archaeological material of Greek houses. She emphasized that the gender associations of particular areas of the house is only one aspect of what is likely to have been a complex pattern of spatial use. However, the early Iron Age and Archaic periods were until recently less privileged by such discussions. Of the 3 geographical regions that we have summarized today, I want to discuss issues of gender ideologies, particularly in relation with one prominent example, that of Zagora in Andros. The appearance of the courtyard houses in Zagora, as we have seen, offers indeed a unique possibility of discussing gendered space in this community. Apparently, the appearance of multi-room houses, and particularly the courtyard houses, which we first see in Zagora by 700 BC, are indicative of male and female symbolic divisions of space in the household. Morris, for example, has argued that even the outer public space and the inner private areas, symbolic associations with masculinity and femininity, respectively, could be traced as far back as the 8th century in examples such as Zagora. Before the 8th century, though, when houses were mostly one-room households without any physical separation to break up the flow of activity, these associations are very hard to establish. The case of the house around rooms H26 and H27, this is sorry, oh, no. This room, which is separated into 2 later, exemplifies the transition of one-room houses and megara into functionally specific multi-room structures after approximately 720 BC. Houses around the rooms H26, 27 in Zagora this was this house was a simple single room originally, and shards from its floor show that cooking, eating, and drinking and storage all went together in the same room. But by 700, the occupants divided this room into 3 smaller houses. I'm talking now about the house above that. So it was divided into 3 different rooms. This one was divided in 2 rooms. And judging from the finds, all of these 3 little rooms were used only for storage. The south wall of the old porch was extended by 8 meters, and 2 new rooms, 840 and 41, were added. And they were built on the end. And 840 was an unusual wide door, has an unusually wide door, which was probably an anteroom to 841, with a monumental stone hearth and many sherds from fine cups. The new house could be reached from the courtyard, and turning right, the visitor was entering through the wide doorway into the public area of the house, for probably where feasting activities were taking place. But turning left, you could reach the storerooms at the back. Now, attributing gender to excavated space is generally difficult, but by this we are not suggesting that men or women were restricted to particular parts of this house. Certainly, women went into Zagora rooms 840 and 41, and men also went into the storage rooms 24, 25, and 32. But what we want to emphasize is that perhaps the ideas about gender space, which we see in later classical households, began to take shape in the late 8th century. The courtyard houses that we see in Zagora by 700 BC start gradually to cut off the individual house from other units, as the ikos now could be accessible only through a narrower door, preventing those passers-by and the outside world from having a clear visual of the activities that were happening inside the house. Difficulties in interpreting patterns in the material record as gender-related activities in the context of the early Iron Age and the classical world were primarily due to the fact that these interpretations are based on vague assumptions with few concrete models available. One basic assumption is that the duality of patterning and dichotomy in artifact types can be directly related to the duality of gender roles, and that's often very difficult to ascribe to the Iron Age material. However, there are many socio-cultural and natural formation processes which will affect the basic pattern and create variation in the archaeological record. A better understanding of the socio-cultural aspects of patterning of gender-related activities within a household unit as well as within settlements would enable us to interpret the archaeological record better. Now, it remains to discuss the temporal dimension of activities within a household and the way that these activities are reflected in the archaeological record of the excavated houses. To explain this dimension, we need to return to a fundamental statement of the sociological analysis of the household, the one that admits that the dynamic flow of social life is speedy and that its time scales are short-term. Consideration of these short-term timescales is therefore particularly meaningful to the examination of daily patterns and life stages. The archaeological impact of daily and life stage timescales has rarely been explored, despite the fact that the archaeological investigation of domestic space has become an area of interest. It is, however, here that the aggregate of the quotidian behaviors and activities can be most dramatically misinterpreted if the remains are read amorphously as a long-time trend. Indeed, in very few excavated examples, continuous occupation can be demonstrated for more than about a century, and most were in use for much shorter periods. This is apparent in many of the case studies examined here in the Aegean and Crete, where throughout the whole transition between the early Iron Age and the Archaic periods, only very few examples of households demonstrate a continuous use encompassing many generations. Moreover, the situation where household units can be said not to be only architecturally distinct, but also characterized by a recurrent association of features and artifacts, allowing thus a more or less secure interpretation of even short-term activities in the household, is extremely rare in the time frame of the early Iron Age. And this rarity should not only be reckoned as an interpretational problem, but also something testifying a trend towards the apparently random distribution of what ought to be socially significant artifacts in domestic architecture of the early Iron Age. This situation is illustrated in an important number of cases, including examples in Halasmenos and Vrokastro in Crete, as well as in Zagora and Andros, Tsikalario in Naxos for the Cyclades, or the Emporio bench houses in the Eastern Aegean. There, even high-profile activities such as cooking appear to have non-fixed location in many occasions, in both cases of the early Iron Age households, or even the later classical households. In almost all case studies examined here in the Aegean and Crete, excavation appears to pick up evidence for where objects were stored best of all. Secondarily, it reveals a confused and fragmentary mixture of different kinds of activities spread unevenly throughout the domestic space. Finally, the ambiguity of artifact assemblages in the domestic environment may be related to the multiple overlay of routine ephemeral activities organized temporally. With respect to the same problem, while examining classical households, Michael Jameson had suggested that although literary sources may appear to assign specific functions and genders to particular rooms, these designations are very fluid. He emphasized, for example, that the division between men's quarters and women's quarters, as defined by written sources, and their difficult archaeological visibility might be explained best if these are interpreted as sleeping quarters. An important number of functions determining elements of material culture and furnishing for either the early Iron Age or the later households might have consisted of movable items and features. In that sense, beds, for example, might very well have been consisted of sleeping materials or pallets, which would have been rolled up and put away during the day, so that the space can be then reserved for working and living. In brief, Greek domestic material culture was highly portable. Similarly, for example, Amos Rappaport has emphasized that non-fixed feature elements which are not part of the architecture but which are evidently part of the household surely consist a major contribution to insights into household behavior and relationships between social actions and the material record. Now, overall, households are a particular suitable context where short time scales can be shown to have had considerable impact on formation of material record. And it is therefore important to emphasize that these short-term patterns that led to the formation of this archaeological context, in contrast with the long-term patterns which archaeologists are frequently facing. Finally, in our attempt to interpret space through the extremely diversified archaeological material of the Dark Ages and the geometric, the shortage of well-studied ethnographic parallels, the lack of textual evidence, and the dangers of applying biased meanings from text to archaeological reality, all that means that the task can be highly conjectural. Nevertheless, there is at least something that any kind of archaeological material or later classical sources or ethnographic and cross-cultural research about space agrees on, and that is that few aspects of life were so charged with meaning as household space. There is further another reason why household archaeology in the early Iron Age and beyond that, of course, can be a rewarding area of research. Indeed, the degree of diversity, regional differences, and the number of functional transformations occurring here, and I hope that we managed to highlight some of these tonight. In particular geographical areas within limited periods of time, as well as the very nature of the household, allowing an important number of questions about social meaning to be asked to, make this investigation in Greece and the rest of the Mediterranean a very promising research direction. If we consider overall, considered outside the framework of the Aegean Iron Age, understanding the nature of change in household organization would bridge the existing middle-level theory gap in archaeology. And to close by stating something from Wilk and Rachi, when households are seen as an essential level of inquiry, we can in fact, as they have stated, move from the grand theories of cultural change to the practical archaeology of everyday material culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Christophilopoulou, for this very intriguing lecture. Personally, I think it's nice that we moved down to the early Iron Age for a change. But I do have some questions, but I think I'll give somebody else the opportunity to ask questions first. So please. No, I was wondering how you deal with the issue of continuity from late Bronze Age. Because I mean, most of your examples were from late geometric into early archaic and classical, which is interesting to observe the same. But how about the late Bronze Age, from 1200 down?
No, that's true. There isn't many demonstrable examples where you see a household, at least household continuity between the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. And as I saw in most of these examples, there is a late Bronze Age occupation. And then there is abandonment, and then people are returning to reuse the same areas later. And what I was mostly interested was to see the interaction, how people who are returning to a previously inhabited and meaningful environment are facing the decisions, architectural and user space decisions that lie there from the past. But no, I wasn't suggesting that all these sites have clear continuity. There are sites where, Cyprus is a much better example, where you can trace settlements of the early Iron Age that have more or less better continuity with Bronze Age occupation, but I wouldn't say that for the Aegean.
For Crete, perhaps.
Well, Crete, yes.
Yeah.
No, not Progastro.
But not Vrondaz nor Halasmenos. There is an interruption of the occupation there. No, it's very unusual for Cretan sites to be continuously occupied until the 7th century. It's a very rare case.
There's definitely no example in the city.
They return, though, sometimes with a different function. At Vrondaz they return and the site is transformed into a cemetery. But very few sites are continuously.
And I don't think there's any in the Cyclades. In all the examples I've seen in the Cyclades, they have a clear late Bronze Age occupation, an abandonment, and then some of the sites are being reused later, but there is a clear gap between that example of these 2 centuries.
Yeah, but this is why I was wondering, why can you just drop this 1200 from your title? Because why can't you just drop 1200 from your title? Because, I mean, you speak mostly about late geometric and Francis, yeah. So why have 1200 as a date in your title of your lecture at all? Because, I mean, you're not really dealing with late Bronze Age. You are not really dealing with late Bronze Age at all, no.
No, I'm not really dealing with Bronze Age. I'm looking at the latest of the late Bronze Age example, exactly because I'm interested to see the interaction between sites that were previously occupied and then become important communities in the early Iron Age. Because I think actually that household archaeology is one way of explaining how people felt when they faced space that was previously reused. And that's something that we can't really trace very well from mortuary evidence, but it's very interesting to trace it through household evidence, exactly because the household is so charged with, with meaning and activities. But I definitely don't claim to be a Bronze Age expert. So.
Okay, I think I get your point.
Anastasia, thank you very much. It was very interesting. It is a methodological concern that crossed my mind during all the time that you were talking. How certain are we that you don't have a second story in all these examples? Because in excavation, sometimes it's really difficult to recognize if there was a second floor or not. And if this is the case, how biased then the whole thing might be in the end?
It is difficult to recognize it, particularly if you're judging from the material culture, that you're excavating in a floor. I don't think there are many cases of that there are
doubt about that.
Yes.
So we are pretty certain that it was ground floor.
What we see a lot is spaces that because of the placement of the house in a certain elevation, we see rooms that don't have any doors. And these rooms were accessed from above. Mm-hmm. That is a very common pattern. We see it in Paros, we see it in Chios, in Emporio, in different periods of time. We see it in Crete a lot. Vrokastro has a lot of these examples where rooms are accessed from the roof. I don't think there's a lot of chance of
that.
double stories.
Because talking of the Bronze Age that you mentioned before, for example, in the early Bronze Age, at our recent excavation at Daskaliou, we found that, and we found that I cannot be certain if it was a second story, but otherwise it was certainly some activity on top of the roof, on the terrace. So you have that. You have space that it is being used above, but not so much in these examples. We have found using the roof, yes, which was flat or as a terrace, as an activity area. So you find material inside the room that you can recognize that it has been fallen from above and stuff like that. Or even remains of another floor, which is not the actual floor, but, destroyed remains of the collapsed roof that you can see with that, even vessels and stuff like that, yeah.
That's why I'm saying that I don't think there is evidence for second stories, because if there was, there would be material testifying of
that exists, yeah. Okay.
I can tell you about roofs being used as external activity areas. We know that, particularly in settlements with different, elevation patterns in Crete, but not second stories.
Okay, thank you.
More questions? Yeah, maybe over a glass of wine. Oh, there is one.
You talked about gaps.
Can you use the microphone?
Yes.
Are these gaps consistent along geographical space in various islands?
Sorry.
Abandonments. I thought you talked about abandonments of.
Yes, if there is consistent habitational gaps between the types of no, the situation is extremely varied. There is I wouldn't call it a pattern, but there is a general tendency to have late Bronze Age and settlements that are then being reused, and they form the center of a small community in the geometric times, but I wouldn't call that as a trend in habitation. I think this is something that is generally attested in the Aegean as also in the mainland. But no, there isn't. You can't, for example, compare Paros with a different Cycladic island and say that settlements are abandoned at the same time, and then people are returning to rebuild the same settlement at exactly a specific. There isn't a pattern to that. No.
So these abandonments could not be connected to correspond to a physical catastrophe.
So these abandonments are connected with the general abandonment of late Minoan 3C sites in Crete or late Helladic sites. So they're not connected with. It's a general pattern that.
So I suggest that we continue the discussion over a glass of wine. Thank you once more.